You're watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Joining us is Nandan Unnikrishnan, Distinguished Fellow with the Observer Research Foundation. Nandan, thanks for your time again on StratNews.
Thank you for inviting me.
Your comments on what Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said at the RIAC think tank, where he's again reiterated what the Russians have been doing a lot in terms of the Western concept of the Indo-Pacific. He said the same thing at the Raisina, though there has been some reaction because this is, of course, post-Galwan and post the India-China standoff. How do you see how do you read his comments?
Well, Amitabh, firstly, I think Mr. Lavrov is consistent, if nothing else. I mean, he makes the distinction between the various types of concepts of the Indo Pacific that exist. And even though the American concept has become much, much more inclusive and much closer to what India believes the Indo Pacific is, the Russians believe that this policy is directed at containment of China, which they are willing to publicly voice at this point of time. But their fear is that it may also be extended into containment of Russia. And that is because the official documentation of the United States, their national security documents, describe both China and Russia as adversaries. So clearly, Mr. Lavrov is speaking from his concept of Russia's national interest and what they perceive to be uh, the moves of countries which are not very friendly towards them. On the other hand, I would say that, as I had mentioned earlier to you, that I don't think we really have to get our knickers in a twist about this because this is par for the course. Look, Galwan has happened, yes, but post Galwan, they're supplying everything we have asked them for. So, words and actions are two different things. And I think we should judge them by their actions. And right now, I don't think we can say the Russians have done anything that is inimical to our national interest.
Of course, he's talking about the Western concept of the, and especially the US-led concept of the Indo-Pacific. Interesting to see President-elect Biden now going back to the Asia-Pacific in terms of terminology. But when Mr. Lavrov says, it's an aggressive and devious policy to engage India in anti-China games by promoting Indo-Pacific strategies, of course, he's referring to the Quad, right?
Yes, definitely. I
Mainly.
mean, I suspect he's talking mainly of the Quad. But he also, I think, in a sense, believes that India's decision not to join RCEP could be partly interpreted as that. Although we all know that we have not joined RCEP because it's just not in our national interest at this point of time. So, you see, let's be very clear about it. Russia is going to vociferously defend what it perceives to be its national interest. And right now, it is not in Russia's national interest to break its relationship or even the atmospherics around the relationship with China. It just doesn't work. We in India are in a completely different relationship with China currently, particularly post April. And therefore, we are a little bit more sensitive to anyone making what I would consider friendly overtures towards China. And this would definitely fall in the category of, a friendly jibe at India, at India's policies. But also, let us be very clear about one thing. Russia and India share one fundamental understanding of what they want the future world to be. And that is, they do not want a hegemon to emerge in this area, whether it is China or whether it is the US. But we don't want a hegemon, neither do the Russians. So, as long as that understanding persists with us and with them, there is always enough scope for us to have a fairly robust relationship.
So you'd feel that any comments that feel that it's insensitive of Mr. Lavrov to say it at this current point that India is falling into the Western trap. Well, India has its own interests, like you're pointing out, they're different from Russia right now. So you don't see that as being the comments being insensitive in relation to what's happened with China.
No, you see, what I think is that it is in India's interest to get the United States more deeply into the region in multiple spheres. I mean, I'm not talking of merely militarily, but economically, politically, in every sense. That serves our interest. It is not something that the Russians would per se be against, but if not for the declared policy of the West, a declared policy of hostility towards Russia itself, leave alone China at this point of time, the Russians are also going to be wary of any moves that they seem to think lead towards weakening of India's relationship with Russia. You know, and we have to be clear that it is not as if the United States is not putting pressure on us to dilute our relationship with Russia. So therefore this is a reaction to that. It may be telling Indians that, look, we understand what the US wants, we would like you to understand the same, maybe that kind of thing.
In that sense, I mean, we clearly see Russia's national interest, but is Russia being dismissive of India's national interest? I mean, we are not doing it because the US is pulling us into its orbit. It's obviously in India's national interest.
Well, one is, Amitabh, I think this cuts both ways. In the sense that are we as sensitive to Russia's national interest as we want them to be towards ours? I don't think at any point of time you've had a single statement from President Putin, for example, saying anything that we could misinterpret or interpret as inimical to our interests. That is point one. Point two, the relationship between India and the United States is a dialectical relationship. Just as there are differences of national interest between Russia and India, there are differences of national interest between US and India. And the US obviously is pursuing its national interest when it's developing a relationship with India, a closer relationship. It's not being charitable. Let's be very clear about that. It's not there dispensing some kind of, I love you all kind of biscuits. So therefore, we have to be clear about it. Now, if someone else from outside tells you that we believe this is your national interest, and we have just recently been telling that someone, we believe your national interest is to make up with the Americans, so it's par for the course.
So it's over expectation if you want the Russians to make some kind of a public statement like Lavrov has made now for what happened in Galwan or the India-China standoff.
Look, I think whatever statement they had to make on Galwan was made through action. We are talking to the Chinese. We started with the Russians. Let's be very clear. It was not the United States. It was not anyone else. It's in Moscow that our Defense Minister Rajnath Singh went and met the Defense Minister of China and subsequently, of course, Dr. Jaishankar. So I think the Russians are clear in their minds that they would not like two of their partners to be at each other's throats. But they are not going to mediate between the two. They will not want to take sides, and they would like those tensions to sort of be reduced through the two parties talking to each other. This is their position. The second point is they have a relationship with both, and they are not going to dilute that relationship. So if India requires something to protect its national interests, so far the Russians have not given us any indication that they are stepping back from meeting those necessities.
And you're talking about one of the things would be the S-400s. How do you see what happens in the US when the Biden administration takes over in terms of CAATSA and the S-400? Do you feel that pressure would continue the way it was under the Trump administration?
Look, there are enough fringe elements even amongst the Democrats who would want CAATSA to kick in because they are so rabidly anti-Russian, you know. But I think just as amongst the Republicans, the saner elements prevailed, I think the same saner element will prevail in the Democratic establishment because that is the bipartisan consensus on India. You know, they have agreed that the India relationship is important. It is strategically imperative for the United States to develop it deeper. So I personally am not uh, at this stage expecting an exacerbation of what already is on the table.
You mentioned earlier how Russia and India were on the same page, at least in terms of not wanting a hegemon in this region or in the world order. President Putin's interview in October, I think it was, when he talked extensively about China and the MTC, the military technical cooperation, of boosting the PLA, of even not ruling out an alliance. Do you see that again as that cliche that we use in foreign policy, that there are no permanent friends, there are only permanent interests?
I would tend to agree that there are no permanent friends.
Mm.
We see that even in the case of Russia. You know, at one point they uh, had a military agreement with Nazi Germany. The next, they were fighting a war with them and defeating them. Then they had a relationship with China where they even went to the extent of transferring nuclear technology in the 50s. And then they fell apart and they did battle in the Far East. So subsequently, they have again made up. So everyone moves according to their national interest. So I don't expect the Russians to, you know, make an eternal dying vow that we will always be there. So that should not be my expectation. And if that is my expectation, then I mean, I don't want to sound rude, but I really need to go and have my head examined. I mean, the Russians are not at fault here for my misunderstandings. Uh, Having said that, I would take you back to what Putin said. He
Mhm.
also said, while he said that
Yeah,
his quote was very clear,
yeah.
that theoretically he does not rule out
Mhm.
the
Alliance.
possibility of an alliance,
But right
but
now,
they right now do not see any necessity for it. So he is very clear in his mind that when Russia says that they don't want a hegemon on in this region, China is part of it. After all, there are only two countries
yeah,
that currently sort of pretend or could become possible hegemons. That's the United States or China.
yeah.
So when anyone says we don't want a hegemon, it's clear who they are talking about. And I think at that level, uh, the Russians are very clear. However, let's be also very clear that Russia needs, because the West has cut off uh, finance, technology, and other resources, Russia needs, for its own developmental challenges, it needs these elements from elsewhere. So, what it can get, it'll get from China. What it can get, it'll get from India. What it can get from elsewhere, it'll get from there. So, you know, they're out with a shopping list which is very wide,
Mm.
and they are happy to collaborate with anyone who is willing to help them out. So, if you notice, there is even collaborations going with the Japanese, who by no stretch of imagination
Yeah.
would be called a Russian or a Chinese ally.
And now, when you're talking about the Indo-Pacific, I wouldn't really call it an invitation, but Ambassador Bala Venkatesh had talked about the Indo-Pacific concept that's different from, a US-led concept. We've also seen Russia and Sudan inking a port agreement, naval facility agreement. Do you see Russia involved in the Indo-Pacific in some other manner, possibly?
The Russians have always been around, used to be
Yeah,
Soviet Union. So
yeah.
it's not going to be something that is institutionally new from them. It
Hmm.
is new for modern day Russia because they did not have the wherewithal initially, so they withdrew.
Yeah,
Otherwise, Africa, East Coast,
yeah.
Yemen, Vietnam, Kamran Bay, I mean, they had bases all over the place and facilities. The only thing they continued was in Syria. All the others they shut down.
Hmm.
Now the Russians are slowly improving economically and militarily and resource wise, and they're willing to expand their footprint, as it were. Now, they have conducted quite a few naval exercises
Yeah.
in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean. Some with the Chinese, some with the Iranians, many with us. They have done some even with the South Africans. In fact, the trilateral, it was China, Russia, and South Africa. So these are all its moves to sort of expand its footprint. But they're also in talks with Vietnam, and they are supplying submarines to Vietnam. Again, another reason to point out that they clearly are not on the same
Uh-huh.
page with China on everything, because Russia's Rosneft is in collaboration with Vietnam in the disputed South China Sea for exploration of oil and gas. But anyhow, to cut a long story short, Russia will do everything that it can to stay a relevant global player. And the Sudan move is, I think, part of that. And it is up to us to see whether we can leverage it. Because, as far as I am
Sure.
concerned, India should invite the maximum number of powers into this region. So, between all of them, they will influence each other and dilute the possible influence, negative or positive, that China will have in the region.
Nandan Unnikrishnan, appreciate your insight and your time again. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. You're always welcome.
And for our viewers, if you would like to support our kind of journalism, do log on to our website, do follow our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as well. You've been watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.